In the shadowy docks of 1950s Lisbon, where the Tagus River hides dark secrets, a sailor's brutal murder sparks whispers of smuggling and betrayal. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster from Little Haverford, whose gentle demeanour masks a relentless mind. As another body surfaces and a young woman vanishes, Miss Marple unravels a web of greed, love and lies, hidden ledgers, cryptic shipments, and a mysterious watcher in the shadows. Will she expose the mastermind before the docks claim another life? Dive into a classic Agatha Christie-style mystery, where every glance holds a clue and truth lurks in the smallest details. Chapter 1. The Letter from Lisbon. In the tranquil village of Little Haverford, where the hedgerows bloomed with late autumn hawthorn, and the church bell tolled with comforting regularity, Miss Jane Marple sat in her modest parlour at Rose Cottage. The room, warmed by a low fire, was a study in quiet order. A mahogany table held a silver tea tray. A vase of chrysanthemums glowed softly in the afternoon light, and her knitting, a delicate shawl of pale blue wool, lay draped across her lap. Her needles clicked rhythmically, a counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock, as she gazed thoughtfully at the letter before her. The envelope, slightly creased from its long journey, bore a Portuguese postmark, and the elegant, if somewhat unsteady handwriting of Mrs. Clara Winstead, a school friend from decades past. Miss Marple, whose memory for faces and foibles was as sharp as ever, recalled Clara as a timid girl, prone to fretting over small slights, yet fiercely loyal. Now widowed and residing in Lisbon, Clara had written with an urgency that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. She adjusted her spectacles and reread the letter, her lips pursing slightly at its tone of veiled panic. "My dear Jane," it began, "I am in sore need of your wisdom. Lisbon is a beautiful city, but its docks are a place of shadows, and I fear for my nephew, Lionel Hargreaves, who runs a shipping concern there. He has grown secretive, distracted, and I overhear whispers of trouble. Dangerous men, illicit dealings. Only last week, a sailor was found dead near his warehouse, and the police dismiss it as a drunken quarrel. I cannot shake the feeling that Lionel is entangled in something perilous. If you could come, Jane, your clear head might see what I cannot. I beg you, do not delay." Miss Marple set the letter down, her fingers pausing on the wool. Clara's words stirred a familiar instinct, honed by years of observing the quiet dramas of Little Haverford, the jealousies of choir members, the petty thefts at the vicarage, the unspoken grudges that simmered beneath polite smiles. People, she murmured to herself, are much the same, whether in Little Haverford or Lisbon. Trouble follows where secrets gather. She rose, her movements spry despite her years, and crossed to the window. Beyond the lace curtains, the village green lay still, save for young Tommy Pierce delivering newspapers on his bicycle. Miss Marple's mind drifted to a long-ago incident in Little Haverford, when a grocer's boy had stumbled upon smuggled brandy hidden in a barn. The boy had been silenced with a bribe, but Miss Marple had noted the grocer's nervous glances and unravelled the scheme. Clara's letter, with its talk of docks and dead sailors, hinted at a similar tangle of greed and fear. She resolved to go. Within 2 days, Miss Marple was aboard a steamer bound for Lisbon, her small suitcase packed with sensible woolens, a single volume of Trollope, and her ever-present knitting. The journey was uneventful, save for a tedious conversation with a retired colonel who insisted on recounting his exploits in India. Miss Marple listened politely, her mind elsewhere, already piecing together the fragments of Clara's letter. Lisbon greeted her with a burst of golden light and the briny tang of the sea. Clara's villa, perched on a hill overlooking the Tagus River, was a charming blend of English restraint and Portuguese flair, with tiled walls and a garden of orange trees. Clara herself, however, was a shadow of her former self. Her grey hair was neatly pinned, but her hands trembled as she poured tea, and her blue eyes darted to the windows as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "Oh, Jane, you've come!" Clara exclaimed, clasping Miss Marple's hands. "I scarcely dared hope. It's Lionel. Something's terribly wrong. He's always been so steady, but now he's short-tempered, always at the docks until midnight. And that poor sailor Pedro Almeida, stabbed near the warehouse. It's no mere brawl, I'm sure of it." Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting the fine porcelain and the faint strain in Clara's voice. "Tell me about Lionel," she said gently, "and these docks. What sort of business does he conduct?" Clara explained that Lionel, a former naval officer, had inherited a small shipping company, ferrying goods, wine, olives, cork, across the Mediterranean. Lately, though, he had taken to meeting unsavoury characters, rough sailors, a sharp-eyed customs man, and a woman Clara barely knew, his secretary, who seemed overly protective. "And there's talk," Clara added, lowering her voice, "of things moving through the docks that shouldn't, stolen goods perhaps or worse." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and bird-like, missed nothing. The way Clara's fingers twisted her handkerchief, the distant cry of gulls, the faint scent of lavender from the garden. "We must visit these docks," she said, "tomorrow perhaps. A clear view often reveals what words conceal." Clara hesitated, then nodded. "But be careful, Jane. Lisbon is not Little Haverford. The docks are no place for an old spinster." Miss Marple's smile was disarming. "My dear Clara, I have found that wickedness thrives in familiar places, whether a village shop or a city port. Now tell me more about this sailor Pedro. Who was he to Lionel?" As Clara spoke haltingly of Pedro, a loyal worker, recently uneasy, Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking. Her mind, however, was far from idle, already sifting through the patterns of human nature, as predictable as the stitches in her shawl. Lisbon's docks, she sensed, held secrets as old as sin itself, and she would unravel them, one quiet observation at a time. Chapter 2. The Docks at Dusk. The Alfama district of Lisbon, with its cobbled alleys twisting like threads in a tangled skein, led Miss Jane Marple and Clara Winstead toward the docks, as the sun dipped low, painting the Tagus River in hues of amber and slate. The air carried the sharp tang of salt, mingled with tar and the faint sweetness of rotting fruit from crates stacked haphazardly along the waterfront. Warehouses, their wooden facades weathered by years of sea spray, loomed like silent giants, their shadows stretching across the uneven stones. Miss Marple, her black shawl drawn about her shoulders, stepped carefully, her sensible shoes clicking softly, her eyes as alert as a sparrow's. Clara, clutching her handbag, glanced nervously at the sailors lounging against barrels, their laughter coarse and fleeting. "I don't like this place, Jane," she whispered. "It feels watchful." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind cataloguing every detail. The creak of a ship's rigging, the flicker of a lantern in a warehouse window, the way a docker's gaze lingered too long on their approach. Places like this, she said softly, are much like the back lanes of Little Haverford. They hide their secrets in plain sight, if one knows where to look. They reached the offices of Hargreaves Shipping, a squat building wedged between two larger warehouses. Its sign, faded but proud, swung gently in the evening breeze. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ink, tobacco, and old wood. Captain Lionel Hargreaves stood behind a cluttered desk, his broad frame filling the small room. His naval jacket, though neatly pressed, hung loosely as if he had lost weight, and his eyes, a stormy grey, betrayed a weariness that no smile could mask. "Aunt Clara, really?" Lionel said, his voice a mix of affection and exasperation. "You needn't have dragged Miss Marple into this. The docks are rough, but there's nothing here a village spinster would find interesting." His glance at Miss Marple was polite but dismissive, a mistake she had seen many make before. "Oh, but I find all human endeavours fascinating," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild as she adjusted her spectacles. "Your work must be quite absorbing, Captain. Moving goods across the sea. Wine, perhaps, or cork. Such a responsibility." Lionel's jaw tightened, but he gestured to a chair. "It's a living. Keeps the ship sailing." He introduced his foreman, Miguel Costa, who entered with a ledger under his arm. Miguel was slight, with quick dark eyes that darted from Miss Marple to Clara, as if weighing their intent. His hands, calloused but nimble, betrayed a man accustomed to more than paperwork. Behind him stood Sophia Mendez, Lionel's secretary, a woman of perhaps 30, with sleek black hair and a composed manner that bordered on defiance. Her navy dress was immaculate, but Miss Marple noted the faint ink stains on her fingers, suggesting long hours at the typewriter. "Miss Mendez keeps the books in order," Lionel said, a touch of warmth in his voice. Sophia inclined her head, her smile fleeting, and Miss Marple wondered at the undercurrent between them. Was it loyalty or something deeper? The office itself was a study in contrasts. Orderly ledgers stacked neatly, yet a map on the wall was pinned crookedly, its edges curling. A photograph in a silver frame caught Miss Marple's eye. A young woman with a wistful smile, her dark eyes gazing somewhere beyond the camera. Beside it, a brass paperweight shaped like an anchor gleamed, but a faint scratch on its surface suggested it had been moved often, perhaps to conceal something beneath. "Tell me about poor Pedro Almeida," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag. "Such a tragedy, a man cut down so young." Lionel's face clouded. "Pedro was a good worker, reliable. Got into a fight down at the quay, they say. The docks are full of hotheads. The police are looking into it, but there's little to find." Miguel shifted, his fingers tightening on the ledger. "Pedro liked his drink," he said curtly. "Got mixed up with the wrong sort. Happens here." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze resting on Miguel. "In Little Haverford," she said, "we had a butcher's lad who drank too much. Always blamed others for his troubles, but it was his own secrets that undid him. I wonder what Pedro's secrets were." Sophia's pen scratched loudly on her notepad, and Miss Marple noted the sudden tension in her shoulders. Clara, oblivious, pressed on. "Lionel, you must be careful. If Pedro's death is tied to your business, it's not," Lionel snapped, then softened. "Aunt Clara, you worry too much. Now let me show you out before it gets darker." As they stepped into the cooling air, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes catching a figure across the quay. a man in a dark coat, half hidden by a stack of crates. His cigarette glowed briefly, a pinpoint of light in the dusk, before he turned and melted into the shadows. She recalled a poacher in Little Haverford who had watched the vicarage from behind a yew tree, waiting for his moment to strike. "Some men," she murmured to Clara, "prefer to be unseen. It makes one wonder what they fear being seen." They walked back through the Alfama, the narrow streets now cloaked in twilight. Clara's chatter about Lisbon's charm was nervous, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. The photograph of the young woman nagged at her. Its placement on Lionel's desk suggested importance, yet no one had mentioned her. And Miguel's unease, Sophia's guardedness, the watcher in the shadows, each was a thread in a pattern she could not yet discern. Back at Clara's villa, as they sipped tea under the orange trees, Miss Marple spoke thoughtfully. "Your nephew is troubled, Clara. Not just by Pedro's death, I think. There's something he's not telling you, and others are guarding it too." Clara's hands trembled on her cup. "You think it's serious, Jane? Smuggling, perhaps, or worse?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but unyielding. "In my experience, secrets have a way of growing, like weeds in a garden. We shall visit the docks again, and perhaps speak to those who knew Pedro. The truth, my dear, is often in the small things, the glance, the pause, the thing left unsaid." As Clara retired, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting in the moonlight. The Tagus glimmered below, its surface hiding depths she knew held more than fish. She thought of the docks, their creaking timbers and whispered deals, and of Lionel's office, with its map and its secrets. People, she said to herself, are so very careless with their truths. But I shall find them out. Chapter 3. The Widow's Tale. The morning after her visit to the docks, Miss Jane Marple sat at Clara Winstead's breakfast table. The scent of fresh coffee mingling with the citrus tang of orange blossoms drifting through the open window. Lisbon's sunlight spilled across the tiled floor. But Miss Marple's thoughts were on the shadowed quay, where a sailor's life had ended in violence. Clara, still pale from the previous evening's excursion, stirred her tea absently, her eyes flitting to Miss Marple as if seeking reassurance. "I thought we might visit Maria Almeida today," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as the click of her knitting needles, which lay idle beside her plate. "The widow of the unfortunate Pedro. She may know something of his final days, something the docks kept silent." Clara hesitated, her teaspoon clinking against the saucer. "Oh, Jane, are you sure? Maria's a simple woman, grieving. What could she tell us?" Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind her spectacles, held a quiet certainty. "In Little Haverford, I once knew a dairymaid who saw more than anyone guessed, simply because she listened while others talked. Grief, my dear Clara, often sharpens the memory." They set out after breakfast, navigating the steep winding streets of the Alfama to a tenement where Maria Almeida lived. The building was a crumbling affair, its plaster walls stained by sea air, its narrow stairs creaking underfoot. Maria's door, painted a faded blue, opened to reveal a woman in her late 30s. Her black dress severe against her sallow skin. Her dark hair was pulled tightly back, and her hands, clutching a worn rosary, moved restlessly as she ushered them into a sparse room. A single chair, a rickety table, and a crucifix on the wall were its only furnishings, giving it the air of a place stripped bare. By loss. "Senoras, you are kind to come," Maria said, her voice low, accented with the soft cadence of the Lisbon pour. "But I don't know why you'd want to speak of Pedro. The police say it was a fight, a knife in the dark. They say he drank too much." Miss Marple settled onto the chair, her shawl folded neatly over her arm. "My dear Mrs. Almeida, I am no stranger to loss, and I know the police can be hasty. Tell me about Pedro. Was he troubled before it happened?" Maria's fingers tightened on the rosary, the beads clicking like a faint echo of Miss Marple's knitting. She spoke haltingly, her eyes fixed on the floor. Pedro had been a steady man, a deckhand for Captain Hargreaves, proud of his work on the ships. But in the weeks before his death, he had changed, coming home late, his face drawn, his words few. "He said the docks weren't safe anymore," Maria whispered. "He'd seen things, heard things, men talking in the shadows, crates moved at night. He told me to stay away from the warehouse." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was sharp, noting the absence of personal touches in the room. No photographs, no mementos, as if Pedro had feared leaving traces. "Did he mention anyone by name?" she asked. "A friend, perhaps, or someone he distrusted?" Maria shook her head, then paused, her brow furrowing. "Once he spoke of a tavern, O'Farrell. He'd meet his mates there. Jerome, a big man with scars, and others. Pedro said Jerome knew something, but he wouldn't talk. And there was a woman, someone the captain trusted. Pedro didn't like her." Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, resumed their gentle rhythm. "A woman," she mused. "Perhaps the captain's secretary, Miss Mendez." Maria's silence was answer enough, her lips pressing into a thin line. Miss Marple recalled Sophia's guarded demeanour at the docks, the ink stains on her fingers, and wondered what role she played in Pedro's unease. The room grew still, save for the distant cry of a street vendor outside. Clara, perched uncomfortably on the edge of the table, ventured a question. "Maria, did Pedro ever speak of illicit dealings, smuggling, perhaps?" Maria's eyes flashed with sudden fear, and she crossed herself. "He wouldn't be part of such things. Pedro was honest, but he said the captain was in deep, that the shipments weren't what they seemed. He wanted to tell someone, but he was afraid. Then—" Her voice broke, and she turned away, her shoulders trembling. Miss Marple rose, patting Maria's hand gently. "You've been most helpful, my dear. We shan't trouble you further." As they descended the creaking stairs, Miss Marple's eyes caught a flicker of movement across the street. A man in a dark coat, his hat pulled low, standing beneath a lamppost. The glow of his cigarette was a brief spark in the morning haze before he turned and vanished into an alley. She made no remark, but her mind filed the image away, recalling a gamekeeper in Little Haverford who had lurked near the post office, watching for a rival's letters. "Jane, do you think Maria knows more than she says?" Clara asked as they walked back toward the villa, the river glinting below. "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her tone thoughtful. "But fear can silence even the bravest heart. Pedro saw something he shouldn't have, and it cost him his life. We must visit this O'Farrell, Clara. Taverns, like village tea-shops, are places where tongues loosen." That afternoon, as Clara rested, Miss Marple sat in the villa's garden, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the hum of bees. Her thoughts turned to the docks. Lionel's strange smile, Miguel's darting eyes, Sophia's ink-stained hands, and the mysterious woman in the photograph on Lionel's desk. Maria's words about shipments and Pedro's fear suggested a web of deceit, perhaps smuggling, but the woman's role, Sophia or someone else, remained unclear, and the man in the dark coat, always watching, hinted at a larger game. In Little Haverford, she murmured to herself, there was a gardener who hid stolen silver in his shed, thinking no one would notice his late-night walks. But someone always sees. She smiled faintly, her needles clicking faster. The docks, she knew, were no different from her village, full of small betrayals, waiting to be unravelled. Chapter 4. The Tavern's Whispers. The evening air in Lisbon's Alfama district was thick with the scent of grilled sardines, and the low hum of voices spilling from open doorways. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl draped over her shoulders, stepped cautiously into Overall, a tavern nestled in a narrow street near the docks. Its weathered sign, depicting a lighthouse, swung faintly in the breeze, and the glow of oil lamps cast flickering shadows across the cobblestones outside. Clara had pleaded a headache and stayed behind, but Miss Marple, undeterred, had come alone, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, her eyes as keen as ever. Inside, the tavern was a haze of tobacco smoke and raucous laughter. Sailors and dock hands crowded the wooden tables, their faces ruddy from wine and sea air. The bar, scarred from years of use, was tended by a stout woman with a sharp tongue, who shouted orders over the din. Miss Marple chose a corner table, half hidden by a sagging curtain, and ordered a glass of port, which she had no intention of drinking. Her needles clicked softly as she surveyed the room, her demeanour that of a harmless old lady, though her mind was as sharp as the knife that had ended Pedro Almeida's life. The tavern, she noted, was a microcosm of the docks, rough, vibrant and brimming with secrets. At a nearby table, Miguel Costa, the wiry foreman from Hargreaves Shipping, leaned close to a burly sailor with scarred hands, whom Miss Marple deduced was João, the man Maria had mentioned. Their voices were low, but Miguel's gestures were sharp, his fingers jabbing the air as if to silence João's grumbling. João's eyes, bloodshot and wary, darted toward the door, and Miss Marple wondered what burden he carried. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. Across the room, Sophia Mendes sat alone, her navy dress a stark contrast to the tavern's grime. Her fingers toyed with a glass of red wine, and her gaze flicked nervously toward the entrance, as if expecting someone. Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hand, a sign of strain that reminded her of a Little Haverford seamstress who had hidden a lover's letters from her husband. Loyalty, Miss Marple mused, can be a heavy chain. Her attention was drawn to a young man at another table, sketching furiously on a pad of paper. His dark curls fell over his forehead, and his clothes, a paint-stained jacket and scarf, marked him as an artist. His sketches, visible from Miss Marple's vantage, captured the tavern's life. A sailor's weathered face, the curve of a wine bottle, the shadow of a man in a doorway. One drawing, however, stood out. A half-finished portrait of a woman with dark, wistful eyes, strikingly similar to the photograph on Lionel Hargreaves's desk. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. The woman's face, seen twice now, was a thread she could not yet place. Emboldened by curiosity, Miss Marple approached the artist, her smile disarming. "Your sketches are quite remarkable, young man," she said, her voice soft but clear. "May I ask who this lady is? She has such an expressive face." The artist, who introduced himself as Eduardo Viana, flushed with pride. "You've a good eye, Senora. That's Isabel Ferreira, or was. She worked for Captain Hargreaves, helping with accounts. Lovely girl, but she vanished a month ago after a row with the captain. Some say she ran off with a sailor, but I don't believe it. She wasn't the sort." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "In Little Haverford, we had a girl who disappeared after a quarrel, only to be found hiding at her cousin's. People often assume the worst when the truth is simpler. Did you know Isabel well?" Eduardo hesitated, his pencil tapping the sketch. "Not well, but we talked sometimes. She was clever, noticed things, numbers that didn't add up in the ledgers. She told me once she suspected the captain was hiding something. Then she was gone." His voice dropped and he glanced at Sophia, who was now watching them intently. Miss Marple returned to her table, her mind sifting through Eduardo's words. Isabel's disappearance, Pedro's murder, and the whispers of illicit shipments formed a pattern, like the stitches in her shawl. She recalled the scratched paperweight in Lionel's office, the curled map, and the man in the dark coat who had watched from the shadows. Each was a piece, but the whole remained elusive. As the evening wore on, the tavern grew louder, and Miss Marple observed a new arrival. A man in a tailored suit, his face partially obscured by a fedora. He moved with the confidence of authority, exchanging brief words with the barmaid before slipping a note to Miguel. The foreman's face paled as he read it, and he hurried out, Joan trailing behind. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. The man in the suit lingered, his eyes scanning the room, and for a moment they met hers. She smiled vaguely, as if lost in thought, but noted his sharp features and the faint bulge of a cigarette case in his pocket, much like the one the watcher in the dark coat had used. Leaving the tavern, Miss Marple stepped into the cool night air. The river's murmur a soft counterpoint to the tavern's din. She walked slowly, her thoughts turning to Eduardo's sketch and Isabel's disappearance. "A clever girl who noticed numbers," she murmured, "is a dangerous thing in a place like the docks. And yet, she may still be alive, hidden by fear or by someone's protection." Back at Clara's villa, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a steady rhythm. The tavern had revealed much. Miguel's tension, Joan's fear, Sophia's unease, and Eduardo's tale of Isabel. The man in the suit was a new figure, perhaps the watcher from before, or another player in the game. In Little Haverford, she said to herself, there was a postman who carried more than letters, and everyone knew but said nothing. Secrets, like ships, must dock somewhere. She resolved to speak to Sophia again, to probe the mystery of Isabel and the ledgers. The docks, she sensed, were a stage where greed and loyalty played out, and Pedro's death was but the first act. Her needles clicked on, each stitch a step closer to the truth. Chapter 5. The Hidden Ledger. The morning sun filtered through the shutters of Clara Winstead's villa, casting dappled light across the tiled floor where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the distant chime of a church bell. The events of the previous evening at O'Farrell lingered in her mind. Eduardo's sketch of the vanished Isabel Ferreira, Miguel's tense exchange with the man in the suit, Sophia's nervous glances. Each was a thread in a tapestry of deceit, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human frailty, sensed the pattern was close to revealing itself. She sipped her tea, her eyes bright behind her spectacles, and turned to Clara, who was fidgeting with a lace handkerchief. "I think, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as the breeze stirring the orange trees outside. "We must return to Lionel's office today. There are questions only papers can answer, and I've a mind to see what lies behind that desk of his." Clara's brow furrowed. "But Jane, Lionel was so cross last time. He'll think we're meddling." Miss Marple's smile was disarming. "In Little Haverford, I once persuaded a shopkeeper to show me his ledgers by admiring his roses. A little flattery goes a long way, Clara. We shall simply express interest in Lionel's business acumen." They set out for the docks, the Alfama's narrow streets alive with the clatter of carts and the cries of fishwives. The air grew heavier as they neared the waterfront, thick with the scent of tar and seaweed. Hargreaves Shipping's office was quieter today, the quay bustling, but the warehouse doors shut tight. Lionel greeted them with a forced smile, his naval jacket slightly askew, as if pulled on in haste. "Aunt Clara, Miss Marple," he said, running a hand through his greying hair. "Twice in 3 days. You'll tire of this place." "Oh, I find it quite fascinating," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking softly in her bag. "Such a complex operation. Ships, cargoes, accounts. You must be very proud, Captain." Her tone was admiring, but her eyes noted the strain in Lionel's jaw, the way his fingers drummed on the desk. As Lionel launched into a vague explanation of shipping routes, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the desk. The photograph of Isabel Ferreira remained, its silver frame catching the light. But the brass anchor paperweight was slightly askew, revealing a faint outline of dust. A sign it had been moved recently. She recalled the scratched surface from her first visit and wondered what it concealed. "Might I see your ledgers?" she asked, her voice innocent. "In Little Haverford, our vicar kept such meticulous records, and I do admire good bookkeeping." Lionel hesitated, then shrugged, pulling a ledger from a shelf. "Nothing exciting, I'm afraid. Just wine and cork shipments." He opened it to a page of neat columns, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. The locked drawer in the desk, barely noticeable, had a keyhole that gleamed with recent use. She smiled faintly, her mind recalling a Little Haverford grocer who had kept a secret cash box under his counter, locked but not impenetrable. As Lionel turned to answer Clara's nervous question about dock safety, Miss Marple slipped a hairpin from her shawl. With a deftness honed by years of untangling knitting wool, she eased the drawer open, her movements concealed by the desk's bulk. Inside lay a slim, leather-bound ledger, its pages marked with cryptic entries. "Special cargo, Alexandria, 5,000 escudos. Marseille, 3,000, no questions," and dates that aligned with Pedro Almeida's final weeks. The figures were far higher than any wine shipment could justify, and a faint pencil mark, "IF queried," caught her eye. Isabel Ferreira, she thought, had been more than a bookkeeper. Before she could read further, the door swung open and Sophia Mendez entered, her face paling as she saw Miss Marple near the desk. "Miss Marple, you shouldn't," she began, her voice sharp, then faltered under Miss Marple's gentle gaze. "My dear," Miss Marple said, closing the drawer with a soft click, "I was merely admiring the captain's paperweight. Such a fine piece." She held up the anchor, its scratches glinting, and Sophia's eyes widened as if she knew its secrets. "You must be very busy, keeping all these records in order. Isabel Ferreira helped with that, didn't she?" Sophia's hands clasped tightly, the ink stains on her fingers stark against her pale skin. "Isabel, Yes, she was good with numbers. Too good, perhaps. Her voice was barely a whisper, and she glanced at Lionel, who was now distracted by a knock at the door, a delivery boy with a crate manifest. Miss Marple seized the moment. "Sophia, my dear, you knew Isabel well. Did she ever speak of trouble here? Numbers that didn't add up, perhaps?" Her tone was kind, but her eyes were sharp, like those of a little Haverford spinster who had once coaxed a confession from a pilfering maid. Sophia hesitated, then spoke in a rush. Isabel asked too many questions. She found discrepancies in the accounts, shipments that didn't match the cargo. She confronted the captain, and then she was gone. I thought she'd left Lisbon, but now I'm not sure. Her voice broke, and she turned away, busying herself with papers. Lionel returned, his expression darkening as he sensed the tension. "Miss Marple, Aunt Clara, you mustn't tire yourselves. Let me walk you out." His tone was firm, but Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the way his hand lingered near the desk. As they left, Miss Marple glanced back, catching a glimpse of Miguel Costa slipping into the office, his eyes meeting Sophia's in a silent exchange. Outside, the docks were alive with the creak of cranes and the shouts of stevedores, but Miss Marple's mind was on the ledger. "Special cargo," she murmured to Clara as they walked away. In Little Haverford, a farmer once hid stolen antiques in his hayloft, calling them special stock. I wonder what Lionel's cargo hides. Back at the villa, as Clara fretted over Lionel's secrecy, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting a steady rhythm. The ledger's entries, Alexandria, Marseille, high payments, pointed to smuggling, perhaps antiquities, as Eduardo had hinted. Isabel's initials in the ledger suggested she had uncovered the truth, and her disappearance was no coincidence. Sophia's fear, Miguel's unease, and the man in the suit from the tavern loomed large in her thoughts. "Secrets," she said softly, "are like stitches. Pull one, and the whole fabric unravels." Chapter 6. The Shadow Moves. The Lisbon dawn broke with a soft glow over the Tagus, its waters shimmering like molten silver. But a chill hung in the air as Miss Jane Marple sat in Clara Winstead's garden, her knitting needles idle for once. The hidden ledgers, cryptic entries, special cargo, high payments, Isabel Ferreira's initials, had confirmed her suspicions of smuggling, likely antiquities, moving through Hargreaves shipping. Yet the puzzle was incomplete. Isabel's disappearance, Pedro Almeida's murder, and the man in the dark coat who watched from the shadows hinted at a deeper conspiracy. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, scanned the horizon as she pondered her next move. Clara joined her, her face drawn. "Jane, you've been so quiet since yesterday, that ledger. Do you think Lionel is truly involved in something criminal?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but guarded. In Little Haverford, a baker once swore his flour was pure, but the grit in his bread told another story. "We must look closer, Clara, but discreetly. The docks have eyes." Their conversation was interrupted by a boy delivering a crumpled newspaper, its headline stark: "Second death at docks. Sailor found dead in river." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The article named Joe Pinto, a dockhand known to frequent Overall, found floating in the Tagus with his throat cut, the police attributing it to another drunken brawl. Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking, her mind racing. Juan, the scarred sailor she had seen arguing with Miguel Costa at the tavern, was no random victim. 2 deaths, she murmured. No coincidence. Someone is tying loose ends. Determined to uncover more, Miss Marple persuaded Clara to accompany her to the docks, though Clara's reluctance was palpable. The quay was quieter today, the air heavy with the scent of fish and diesel. At Hargreaves Shipping, Lionel was absent, but Sophia Mendes was at her typewriter, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Winstead," she said, her voice strained. "You've heard about Juot. It's dreadful. The docks are cursed." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her questions were precise. "My dear, Juot was a friend of Pedro's, wasn't he? Did he ever speak of the shipments Pedro mentioned? The ones that troubled him?" Sophia's fingers froze on the keys, and she glanced toward the office door. "Juot was loud, always complaining. He drank too much, said things he shouldn't. I told him to be careful, but he wouldn't listen." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple noted the way her hands twisted together, as if wrestling with a secret. Before Miss Marple could press further, Miguel Costa entered, his wiry frame tense, his eyes darting to Sophia. "The captain's at the warehouse," he said curtly. "If you need him, I'll fetch him." His tone was polite, but his posture suggested haste, and Miss Marple wondered what urgency drove him. Excusing herself to admire the view, Miss Marple slipped out, her black shawl blending with the lengthening shadows as dusk fell. She followed a narrow alley beside the warehouse, her steps silent, her senses alert. Little Haverford. She had once trailed a poacher through a copse, guided by the snap of twigs. Here, the creak of crates and the murmur of voices led her. Hidden behind a stack of barrels, she saw Miguel speaking to a man in a dark coat. The same figure she had glimpsed before, his cigarette glowing faintly. His voice, low and authoritative, carried words that chilled her. "The next shipment must go tonight. No mistakes, Miguel. The boss won't wait." Miguel nodded, his face tight with fear, and accepted a small package, tucking it into his jacket. The man in the coat turned, his features briefly illuminated by a passing lantern. Sharp cheekbones, a thin moustache, and the glint of a customs badge on his lapel. Miss Marple's breath caught. A customs official, Antonio Ribeiro, she recalled from a dockside rumour, was known for turning a blind eye to certain cargoes. His presence confirmed the smuggling scale, but who was the boss he mentioned? As the men parted, Miss Marple retreated, her heart steady despite the danger. Back at the villa she sat by the fire, her knitting a rhythmic solace as she shared her findings with Clara. "Juot's death was no brawl," she said softly. "He knew too much, like Pedro. And Isabel, her disappearance is the key. She saw the truth in those ledgers, and someone ensured her silence." Clara's hands trembled. "But is she alive, Jane? And Lionel, what part does he play?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Lionel is entangled, but I suspect he's not the mastermind. Antonio Ribeiro, the customs man, is a link, but there's someone above him. In Little Haverford, a church warden once hid stolen relics behind his hymnals, thinking himself clever. But there was always someone cleverer." She resolved to confront Sophia again, sensing the secretary held more than she admitted. The ledger's mention of IF queried suggested Isabel had challenged the smuggling, perhaps threatening to expose it. Was Sophia protecting her, or guarding Lionel's secrets? And the package Miguel received, what did it contain? Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, each stitch a step toward clarity. As night fell, the Tagus glittered under a crescent moon, its surface hiding depths where Juot's body had been found. Miss Marple gazed out, her mind weaving the threads, Pedro's warnings, Joan's murder, Isabel's vanishing, Antonio's whispered orders. The docks, she murmured, are a stage, and the players are growing careless, but I shall watch, and I shall see. Chapter 7. The Truth on the Docks. The evening air over Lisbon's docks was heavy with the scent of salt and tar, the Tagus River reflecting the last embers of a crimson sunset. Inside the cramped office of Hargreaves Shipping, Miss Jane Marple sat serenely, her knitting in her lap, her black shawl draped over her shoulders. The room, lit by a single oil lamp, cast flickering shadows across the faces of those gathered. Clara, Winstead pale and anxious, Lionel Hargreaves, his broad shoulders slumped, Sophia Mendes, her hands clasped tightly, Miguel Costa, his eyes darting to the door, and Antonio Ribeiro, the customs official, whose sharp features betrayed a flicker of unease. Outside the quay was quiet, but Miss Marple had ensured the police waited nearby, alerted by a discreet note slipped to a constable that morning. "My dear Clara," Miss Marple began, her voice soft yet commanding attention. "You asked me to unravel the trouble at these docks, and I believe I have done so. It is a sad business, but human nature is much the same, whether in Lisbon or Little Haverford. Greed, fear, love, they leave traces like footprints in a garden." Lionel shifted, his jaw tight. "Miss Marple, there's no need for this. Pedro and Joan's deaths were dockside quarrels, nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind her spectacles, met his. "In Little Haverford, a farmer once claimed a missing sheep was stolen, but the wool in his barn told a different tale. Let us speak plainly, Captain. Pedro Almeida was no drunken brawler. He discovered a smuggling ring, antiquities, I believe, moving through your company. The ledger I found in your desk, hidden beneath that scratched paperweight, listed special cargo to Alexandria and Marseille, with payments far too high for wine or cork." Sophia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, but Miss Marple continued, her needles clicking softly. "Pedro grew uneasy, as Maria told me. He spoke of crates moved at night, of men in the shadows. He confided in Joan, his friend who was less discreet. When Pedro confronted you, Captain, he became a threat. And so he was silenced, stabbed near the warehouse." Lionel's face paled. "I had no part in murder. The smuggling, yes, I admit it, antiquities, small pieces to make ends meet. But Pedro's death was Antonio's doing," Miss Marple said, turning to the customs official. Antonio's cigarette case gleamed as he reached for it, but his hand froze under her gaze. "You, Senor Ribeiro, facilitated the smuggling, turning a blind eye for a share of the profits. I overheard you in the alley, speaking of the boss and a shipment. When Pedro threatened to expose the operation, you killed him, knowing a dockside brawl would be an easy excuse." Antonio's eyes narrowed. "You've no proof, old woman. Words in an alley mean nothing." Miss Marple's smile was serene. In Little Haverford, a poacher thought his whispers in the woods were safe, but a child overheard and told the truth. Joan, too, overheard too much. He was at Oferol, arguing with Miguel, perhaps demanding a larger cut or threatening to talk. So, you silenced him as well, Senor Ribeiro, leaving his body in the Tagus." Miguel shifted, his wiry frame tense. "I didn't touch Joan. I only followed orders from the boss," Miss Marple interjected, her tone gentle but firm. "But you, Miguel, carried messages, moved crates, accepted packages, like the one Antonio gave you last night. You were loyal, but fear made you careless." Clara's voice trembled. "But Jane, what of Isabel Ferreira? Is she dead?" Miss Marple turned to Sophia, whose face was a mask of anguish. "Miss Mendes, you loved Lionel, didn't you? Enough to protect him, even when you suspected his crimes. Isabel, your friend found the same ledger I did. Her initials, IF queried, marked her discovery. She confronted Lionel, as Eduardo told me, and vanished. But she is not dead, is she? You helped her flee, hid her somewhere safe, perhaps a convent, to keep her from harm." Sophia's shoulders slumped, tears spilling. "I couldn't let her die. She was going to the police, but I begged her to run. I took her to the convent of San Vicente, gave her money. She's safe, but she swore never to return." Lionel's voice broke. "I didn't want her hurt. I loved her, but she wouldn't listen. The smuggling, it was Antonio's plan, his contacts. I was trapped." Antonio lunged for the door, his cigarette case clattering to the floor. But the police burst in, seizing him. "You'll prove nothing," he spat. But his bravado faltered as an officer produced the package from Miguel's jacket. Stolen figurines, wrapped in cloth, bound for Marseille. Miss Marple's needles paused. "The boss, I suspect, is a merchant abroad, pulling strings from afar. The police will find him. With those figurines as evidence, love, greed, fear, they undid you all. In Little Haverford, a grocer hid stolen goods in his cellar, thinking himself clever. But someone always sees." As the police led Antonio and Miguel away, Lionel sank into a chair, his face ashen. "I never meant for blood, Miss Marple. It was just money." Clara clutched Miss Marple's hand, tears in her eyes. "Jane, you've saved him from worse. Thank you." Miss Marple's smile was wistful. "Human nature, Clara, is a tangled skein, but a few tugs, and it unravels." The next morning, as Miss Marple boarded a steamer for home, her shawl complete, the docks faded into the mist. She thought of Isabel, safe in her convent, and of Lionel, who would face justice but perhaps find redemption. The Tagus gleamed, its secrets laid bare, and Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, ready for the next mystery to unravel in Little Haverford.